This is A Geek Leader. Hey guys, John Rath back again with episode 65 of A Geek Leader podcast, and today on the show I've got author Tom Rath. Tom Rath is a researcher and writer who studies the role of human behavior in business, health, and well-being. Tom has written six New York Times bestselling books over the past decade, starting with his number one bestseller, How Full Is Your Bucket? And in 2016, his book, Strength Finders 2.0, which many of you may have done the assessment through your work, as I did, it was listed by Amazon as the top-selling nonfiction book of all time. That's right, of all time in 2016. Tom's bestsellers include Strength-Based Leadership, Well-Being, Eat, Move, Sleep, and Are You Fully Charged? He's also written two children's books and produced a full feature-length documentary. And in total, Tom's books have sold more than 6 million copies, and they've made over 300 appearances on the Wall Street Journal best-selling list. So I'm pretty excited to have him on the show. We talk about health, wellness, business in general. And with all that being said, please give it up for Tom Rath.
Thanks so much. It's great to be talking with you.
If you could, tell us a little bit about how you got into writing some of these books based on strengths and what you think is most important about strengths.
Sure. I started off in my career working mostly in technology and research. So I was always kind of a math and numbers guy, and was actually, I think, told by an English teacher in high school that I should stick with math and numbers because that's what I was good at, not writing. So my journey into writing was kind of an unlikely path where I was working on an assessment we were trying to put together as the internet was coming around in the late 1990s with my grandfather, Don Clifton. That assessment turned out to be StrengthsFinder that we put together. And in the middle of that, Don, my grandfather, found out that he had stage 4 gastroesophageal cancer. So make a long story kind of short, I traveled all over the country with him trying to help him stay alive a little bit longer. And in that process, he asked me if I'd help him to write up some of his thoughts and learnings over his career. And that book ended up becoming How Full Is Your Bucket, which was the first book I worked on and the first book that we published when I was at Gallup with Gallup Press. And that's what kind of started off a lot of the other research and books that I've worked on ever since then. But it was, to be really honest, a very unlikely path that I never would have guessed I would follow.
Yeah, I remember reading in one of your books, you mentioned that you were an IT project manager at one point, and it's kind of a strange transition to get into, to move from that into an author.
Yeah, I was much more comfortable in the IT project manager role, and I still probably would be more comfortable in that role today, to be honest. So that's why I think what I've tried to do with a lot of the books I've worked on since then is to stay as close as I can to the most recent research on everything from businesses and workplaces to health and well-being, and then to try and bring that into books as a basis. And to be really candid, I always have to remind myself I start with a draft of a book that's probably more of a research and literature review than a narrative book, and I have to go back in after the fact and try and make sure that I've filled it in with enough stories to kind of carry people through, because I think I'm naturally someone who enjoys putting things together and distilling important knowledge, but I'm not a reporter or writer by nature.
I think that's one thing I really like about your books is the fact that they're so research heavy, and the fact that, there's so many facts that kind of based on, the information that you're saying. It's not just your opinions, but there's a lot of research that goes into this and a lot of numbers that kind of back it up. And being from a technical background, those numbers are important to me.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've learned over the years is that, if nothing else, if you start with the most rigorous research and facts that are available, it helps to point you in the right direction even faster. And then, of course, everybody always has to experiment with trial and error as a sample of one. But in everything that I've done with my writing and my own kind of personal decisions and behaviors in life, I try and gather as much information to at least make better informed decisions about things.
So I want to talk about some of the things that I got out of a couple of your books. and ask you some questions about them, if that's okay.
Great.
With Are You Fully Charged? You talk a little bit about working in burst. What's the importance of actually working in burst? Because I've kind of been, I guess, brought up in school that you're supposed to kind of dive in and work for long periods of time. And when you mentioned working in short bursts and taking breaks, I think there was one story about a school somewhere where they did 45 minutes on and 15 minutes off. Can you talk a little bit about how that affects us and why that may be beneficial for us?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the school experiment because, I have a couple of kids who just started second and fourth grade last week. And when I look at their schedules throughout the day, I think at that level, their teachers are beginning to realize that if you don't get kids at that age to stand up and move around and get the wiggles out every 15 or 20 minutes, there's no way they're going to be paying attention, let alone learning something they recall a day later throughout the day. And it's not that much different as we grow older and spend time in the workplace where, from a physical health standpoint, I think it's ideal for anyone to at least stand up and move a little bit every 20 minutes just from a physical health standpoint. When you look at research that's more based on mental concentration, even if you're really focused on a task that you're doing, a routinized task, creative task, you still need a little mental break and refresher at least once an hour based on the most recent work that I've read, where when they study top performers who really get a lot done during the day, they see that they work for about 52 minutes in a row on average, and then they take breaks that range somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes on average. So we need these little periods of renewal or bursts just to kind of give us the physical and mental refresher to keep going throughout the day. And I agree with what you'd mentioned earlier, that I grew up in a generation where the conventional wisdom was always that you just keep working as long and as hard of a continuous hours as you can, and that's the key to achievement or success in life, is just to work more, work harder, and keep doing that and repeat day after day, week after week. But I think when you look at everything from creative people and artists and singers to people who are working in clerical office roles to scientists and inventors, what you see time and time again is that people need to have some type of a mechanism or ritual built in to ensure that they're refreshing their mental and physical health throughout the day.
Yeah, I think that's good. One of the things that when I first heard about this, I was managing a web and mobile development team at a different company, and I was inspired to kind of do my own research and test this out. So I had my whole team, which was a small team, about 5 or 6 at the time. We started doing the Pomodoro Technique, where we would do 25 minutes on and 5 minutes off and try to do it in sync. So we'd get up and kind of walk around and talk to each other. And then when we were on, we would turn off our instant messengers and close our email so we didn't get notified, and just kind of focus for that short period of time. And I think it really improved not only our productivity, but also our teamwork. We talked more during that 5 minutes and communicated more than we did, if we didn't have that break.
Right. Yeah. There's also something to be said for that, where if you get up and move around every hour and go grab a cup of coffee, you strike up some incidental conversations and have more dialogue. We've all got to be careful, because there's a big shift happening in the workplace where people are going to working more days in a remote format from home. And when they do go into a fixed location or an office, you're not in an office with your colleagues and people you could collaborate with anywhere near as often as you would have been 10 years ago. And because of that changing nature of the workplace, there's increasing value on those even informal and social human interactions we have throughout the day, where we have to find little excuses, especially when we're in a common place, to have those interactions that end up generating a lot of the best ideas and most productive relationships and thoughts for the future in a workplace context.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I know I could probably come into my office here and never see anybody else. But one of the things that we've kind of done in our IT group here is we have our centralized location where we put our coffee maker. Now, I used to have a coffee maker, here at my office, and I could fill up with cups. But then I realized that I'm not going out and seeing the team. I'm not conversing with them. I'm not having those serendipitous moments of running into someone and striking up a conversation. And I think having that central place to where you can go in and out and meet people makes a big difference just as far as happiness and general communication. Yeah,
it's interesting what you say, because we almost have to. I did the same thing for more than a decade when I was working in a traditional office environment every day, and you almost have to reverse engineer where you started. Where my conventional wisdom at first was make sure I have enough snacks in my right-hand drawer that I can access at any time, so I can continue to eat as fast as possible over my keyboard, and then make sure I have a little 1-cup coffee maker right there, so I don't have to get up to do that. And even when you look at what's best for our physical health and what our bodies really need each day, I've seen some companies doing a really good job of this lately, where now instead of having the parking spots for executives in the front row, they're eliminating those spots, and they're painting how many steps you get on each parking stall at the back of the lot, so that people have incentive to park further away to get extra steps. And they're posting how many extra steps you can get by using the stairwell instead of taking the elevator in the workplace, and kind of you almost have to reverse engineer more steps and interactions back into a typical day.
Yeah. And after reading Eat, Move, Sleep, I started tracking my steps with a Fitbit, and now I've got an Apple Watch, and I still track that to make sure I get that 10,000 steps a day. And I've started hacking it a little bit and trying to do those little things that you've talked about, to where if I need to use the restroom, instead of going to the one right here, I take a zigzag approach up 4 flights of stairs to get there, just to get those extra steps in and make sure I hit those goals. Yeah, it's important to have for some people, little trackers work. For others, it's kind of saying that they'll go to the second closest coffee pot in their office, or walk to the third closest Starbucks when they go to their lunch routine, whatever it might be. But we have to find ways to build that in. I was just reading some research with people who are aging, and talking about how one of the most important predictors of whether someone will survive that has heart disease in their 60s and 70s is simply whether they have a dog that they have to walk every day. And it's not that they have a dog. It's probably not the love from the dog, the unconditional love. It's just the fact that they have to get out once or twice a day and walk. And even that marginal amount of activity makes a profound difference. Wow. Yeah, I never really thought about that, but that's an interesting correlation about having to get up and move and care for something. Yeah, it's kind of, but we have to find little ways to trick ourselves into the activity being a part of our default routine. Instead, there's kind of this stasis we fall into where for anyone, the easiest thing to do is to just sit back in a chair for 30 minutes, turn on a television show, look at a social media feed, and not move at all. So how do we break up that default? And it's building little tricks into our routine, whether that's with hiding a healthy snack in your bag so you're not tempted when you are running through an airport and have a lot of bad choices, or whether that's forcing yourself to take more steps throughout the day, or whether that's having a fixed wake-up time so you have to work back 8 hours to go to sleep at the right time. It's kind of building that daily structure pretty carefully so that at a minimum you'll get X number of steps, X hours of sleep, and you'll eat a couple healthy foods in a given day on average. Yeah. I found that one of the things, my daughter, she rides the bus now. She's also in second grade. And there's 2 bus stops right outside of her house. One, if I take a left, it's all downhill and it's not very far away. It's maybe a 1/10 of a mile. But if I take a right, that one's about probably about half a mile, I guess. And it's up and down some rolling hills. So we always go to the one on the right. And I don't think she's figured out that the other one's closer. There's something to be said for that with kids. We've been walking our kids to school, and some people think, they're doing it for the exercise, but everything that I've looked at would suggest that almost all of the benefit in doing that before school in the morning is that it gets a child's brain moving early on, and it's better for their recall and their cognitive ability and their conversations with their peers and teachers when they're in school. So especially early in the morning, there's almost more reason to do it for the sake of productivity and achievement and psychological well-being than there is for the kind of 30 minutes of cardio stuff that we've all heard about for decades. Mm-hmm. No, I agree with you 100%. I think just that little bit of movement wakes you up and makes you a little bit more focused and ready to learn. Right. So you mentioned this changing environment with our workplace and the fact that we're probably connected more through technology and less through actual physical interaction. How do you think that plays in with happiness and well-being and just our overall mental health at work?
I think the ability to be endlessly distracted in the moment through those media makes it far more difficult to sit face to face with another human being and ask them a really good question and genuinely take the time to listen to their response. I think that sounds so simplistic to say out loud, but I think it's going to be one of the hardest things for all of us to do over the next 5-10 years. And on the flip side, though, in a good way, I think it'll add increasing value to that, where those of us who are able to do that and take the time to do that and genuinely dedicate time to those social interactions and ask good questions and listen. And when you're there for someone, that will have exponentially more value because it's so much harder to do and so few people take the time to do it and do it well. So I think it's probably the greatest challenge we face, but there's also a pretty big opportunity there to turn the tide on some of that, because if you really step back and look at a lot of the things that we spend time reading, from social feeds to email to group text messages and chains and messenger things, there's so much stuff that it may be the path of least resistance, but I don't think anyone would argue it's the most rewarding thing you do in a given day when you look at your day at the very end before you go to sleep.
I think you're absolutely right. And I was actually joking around with someone not too long ago. And I don't want to bash, millennials or any generation at all, but we were kind of just talking about the differences between, when I grew up and when some of the people that I'm hiring now grew up. And I had to, if I wanted to go out on a date, I would pick up a phone and I would call and I would talk to the girl's mom and ask for permission to talk to her and have this, I had to be able to interact and have those conversations. Whereas now it's just a swipe right or left,
Mm-hmm. It's a totally different world. And I think there are a couple of forces I see with people who are entering the workforce today. And one is that challenge of social interaction that's live with a person, which is a new challenge. The thing that I think is an asset is that the generation entering the workforce today, from some research I've been doing recently, has much higher and I would say better expectations about what they want a job or work to be. And so that the people entering the workforce today, to be real frank, they don't want to go work for RJ Reynolds or Philip Morris or whoever. They don't want to go work for tobacco companies. They want to work for a company that's actually making the world a little bit better. And they value that, and that's where their actions send their time and energy and attention. So I do have some confidence and faith that our workplaces will be a little bit better 10 years from now, because people entering the workforce have higher expectations about what they want their work to do for society.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I definitely agree with you that people are more focused on the meaning behind their work, the purpose, versus just, picking up a paycheck.
Right. It's changed so much over my lifetime, where I think as I was entering the workforce, and especially the generation before me, you could see that work was primarily a paycheck, and that was about it. And if you happen to also enjoy it and you were in that lucky little small slice, then you were even happier about things. But that was the exception. I think we're going to get to a point where that becomes the default or base expectation, where right now, most people, based on the work I've done, most people think that their lives are worse off because of the organization that they work for. But it's close. I think that tide will tip sometime in the next 10 years.
Wow, that's kind of disappointing that people think that their lives are worse off because of their jobs.
Yeah, there's a friend of mine, Jeff Pfeffer, who just published a really good book with a really even more damning title. It's called "Dying for a Paycheck," and he's a Stanford professor, done a lot of good research on this. And that, to me, his book title sums up the typical relationship between a person and an organization over the last 25 to 100 years, I suppose, that most people have kind of been, their physical health and their mental health have been worse off because of the organizations that they chose to join. And boy, that it sounds backwards when you say it out loud, but I think we're starting to have a conversation about how we fix it.
Mm. Yeah, it's definitely something. I can see that. I know when I got my first full-time job and I told my dad I was looking for something else, and he's like, well, shouldn't you be loyal to that company? Because he worked for the same company for, a couple of decades. I said, well, yeah, but if I want to do something that makes me happier, then I need to do this. And I do think that is a shift that people are going through. And it's kind of disappointing that it's taken as long as it has.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the progress has been so much slower, and it's, to be really honest, it's been harder than I would have thought to get organizational leaders focused on the need for their employees to have better well-being because they're part of the company. Most leaders, I think, grew up in a generation and still don't see it as the company's place or role to make sure that people's lives and families and health are better off. That's just not the way they've thought about the relationship. They don't have bad intent by any standards, in 99% of the cases I've seen, but they just don't think that's a part of the company's mission. So it might take each of us as individuals saying, I need to take responsibility and make sure that my life's not subtly eroding behind the scenes because of my relationship with this organization and the job that I have right now. And I think as each of us as individuals start to take that ownership, and then a new generation moves into leadership roles in companies, hopefully we'll get to a better place. But it probably takes a generation.
Yeah, I'd say we are definitely in charge of our own happiness as an individual. We can't really put that blame on someone else. But as a company and as a business, there is a good ROI for having happy employees.
There's a huge ROI for it, even just from I've studied a lot on health risk and physical health and that relationship with employers, and especially in the U.S. where employers are responsible for all the physical health costs. There's a direct return case for companies to invest more in it. But yet, to be a little bit cynical about it, but almost every company does some type of an employee satisfaction survey, or they have an employee engagement survey, and they do this work. But almost all of those instruments are designed to figure out if the company is getting enough discretionary effort out of the person, right? It's kind of the focus. And they're not designed to say, is the person's life better off because they're affiliated with the company? And so but then each of us as individuals, we're really not tracking that either. And so what happens is what gets tracked gets acted on, right? And so there's not a lot of energy around fixing what the employee's getting out of it.
So what can we as managers or team leads do to kind of, flip that script a little bit and help out, even though we're not in charge of our company? What can we do as a mid-manager to try to improve the life of our employees?
I would argue that based on all the really good research that my colleagues that I worked with at Gallup have done over the years, that there's no one that has more ability to have a positive influence and control and change that situation than managers in particular, because the best managers that I've studied and spoken with over the years, they really view the development and growth of each person as the most important and or dependent variable in itself, not just sucking as much productivity for a short-term need out of a person. And boy, when you get the right manager, not only is your life better off, you get more done. Most spouses and kids and friends we have outside of work, they can tell when we've got a really good manager versus a really bad one. And so I think that's probably the primary point of influence, where if you really continue to invest in what's best for the people you lead or manage and keep that as the focal point of your radar screen, and of course making sure that you're achieving the company's goals in parallel and so forth, I think that's really where each of us can have the most impact, especially if you're in a management role.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've always heard that statement that people quit their bosses, not really the company.
Mm-hmm.
So I do believe that managers have the biggest impact and can make that biggest difference. How do you feel like managers can add meaning and purpose, at work, or what is something that we can do to try to do that? Because I know you've talked or written some about, we should search for meaning, not necessarily happiness.
Yeah, and that's the challenge is, I've talked about, a lot of people that you talk about meaning and purpose and mission and all these big highfalutin terms, but really what managers can do is it's about connecting the dots. It's saying, here's what you are doing today or you did this morning to someone who works for you that made a difference or had an influence for a customer, whether that's an internal customer, whether that's an external client, whether that's someone who might end up using a product that you're manufacturing or software that you're developing. And you got to help people ideally every day, at least every week, to see how their efforts that they often get immersed in and lose track of time when they're doing, how those efforts actually produce a benefit for another human being. And the best managers I've seen, they continually do that. So if you're managing people in a food service context, in a kitchen, you need to make sure that the people who are preparing the food see the people who are eating or enjoying the food, or they hear stories from servers of someone who's actually said they enjoyed their meal and it tasted great and so forth. And it's those kind of little connections that re-energize us to do more the next day and keep us engaged with our work and boost our well-being. I think most people want to know, they want to make a contribution, they want to improve the lives of another person on a daily basis, but it's difficult. It's hard work to go back and get those stories and keep the people you serve top of mind.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I've talked about this before, that there's some power in taking a field trip and seeing your work in action, especially for like software developers who write code and may never see the people that use their software. There's a lot of benefit from going and watching someone use your software and connecting with that user and understanding the value that you're bringing for them, and also what you can do to improve their lives in different ways.
Absolutely. It's really well put. I like the way you talk about taking a field trip. That makes it sound infinitely more practical and fun. And if you do that and you see who you're serving, that can re-energize you for weeks or months if you see someone who's really gaining a benefit from the work that you're doing. But at some point, that's what I was talking about earlier with the kind of changing expectation and relationship of people entering the workforce today, where I think we need to get that practical to say, if you look at the daily actions person X is taking, how does that lead to the benefit of improving the quality of life for person Y here and person Z here? And how do we draw these direct lines? How do we draw some dotted lines? And then how can we help people to have some type of a feedback loop for that on an ongoing basis? Because those are the jobs where we need more energy and more effort and more people working there, versus if there are probably, I don't know if it's 1 or 2% or more like 4 or 5% of jobs out there today where they've either been put in place because they've layered into bureaucracy, or they're for products, or they're creating products or services that are actually a detriment to the lives of their customers, which that does exist. And if you can't connect those dots, how do you at least help the people who are in those jobs today to be looking or have roles on their radar that could be more positively influential for people down the road?
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking about it as you were saying that. I can't think of, very many jobs that there's not that positive feedback that you can connect that straight line of what you're doing and the benefit that you're having. There may be a few, but there's not a whole lot.
No, there arguably used to be more, and that is getting better, because I think we're finally reaching a point where corporate leaders and shareholders and the people who run large pension and mutual and hedge funds and the like are asking the question, is the company, from a kind of a shareholder standpoint, producing a societal benefit? And if it's not, at least it doesn't trade at the same levels and multiples that it used to strictly for profit. So that's good. I've seen that come into the conversation the last 3 years more than I ever have in my lifetime.
So I want to change gears just a little bit and talk a little bit about strengths and what are your thoughts on managers focusing on strengths? And I'll tell a little backstory real quick. I know it's really hard for me as a parent when my daughter brings home her report card and one of the grades may not be as good as the others to not focus on that negative grade. How is it that us as managers, we fall in that same role too, where we're doing a review and there's one area where the team member doesn't step up or they're not as highly talented or gifted as they are in other areas. But in a lot of your writings, you say we should focus on those strengths. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you kind of put it in that context, because I think it's important to focus on strengths in terms of where you're reinvesting to have even more growth in the future. But we do also need some focus on blind spots and weaknesses and things that could not only derail us, but could be a problem for our friends, for our customers, for our colleagues, and the people we serve. And so I think there's a place for both of those conversations. And some of the people that I've been interviewing recently, and I talked to them about how they ended up in careers that they really enjoy. Some of the most influential experiences they've had were when they tried jobs that really didn't fit their strengths, and they realized pretty quickly what they did not like doing and decided not to repeat that and find something else. So I think there are places for discovery on both ends of that continuum. The reason why I've spent a lot of time writing about and doing research around strengths is because I think that those things come to the surface pretty easily when you try something and know that you don't enjoy it and it's an area of non-strength. But often when kids in school or people in the workplace realize when they are good at something, all of us are quick to gloss over it and overlook it, and you don't think to double down and reinvest an extra 10 hours of effort in an area where you already showed early signs of strength, instead of spending the same 10 hours working on a weakness. And when we look at people who have turned out to be exceptional performers in certain areas, what they did was they tripled down and quadrupled down in areas where they saw some early traces of talent and knew they might be able to get to a level of greatness. So for someone like me, a lot of it's really just been a kind of a basic math and allocation game of if you spend your entire life and all your development hours trying to be a little bit good at everything, it essentially eliminates your chance of being great at anything in life. So, I mean, if you just try to be a kind of a marginally competent jack of all trades at everything, you don't have time to do something really well that stands out and makes a difference for people. So I think if you look at it more from kind of an allocation of time, where you allocate even more time to the areas where you have traces of talent than you do to the areas that you need to be aware of, but you probably shouldn't spend all your time if you're just horrible at golfing or whatever the activity is, then it starts to make more sense to people.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, actually, to do it based on time. And I've heard some people say that you should just forget your weaknesses and focus, only on your strengths. But I think you said it well when you said that, there's some value in understanding and identifying those blind spots.
Yeah, I would never ignore. I want to know a lot more about my weaknesses personally. I want to be aware of my weaknesses. I want to know how to manage that. I want to know how to surround myself with people who can be a lot better at 80% of the things that need to be done than I ever could be. So I think to have awareness about both strengths and weaknesses is, I don't know if I'd say equally important, but they're both very important. But then to invest more time, energy, and effort in the areas where you do show early traces of talent, because that's where you can have exponential growth.
Yeah, I think that's really, really well said, and something we all need to focus on is not just to forget those weaknesses, but also, pay attention to them, but invest heavy into our strengths, because that is where we're going to be exceptional. So I wanted to hit on eat, move, sleep, because I think our health is extremely important, and a lot of times in technology we get in those ruts where we sit at our desk and we code all day and don't stand up and move enough and don't eat healthy. We pick up the fast food. Some of the things that really hit home with me that I've made some changes on over the past couple of years after reading this book was, and I wanted to get your take on them as well, is no sugar in your coffee. Fruit juices. I grew up being told that, drink your juice, drink your juice, drink your juice. But you say that there may not be the healthiest thing to do. Why is that?
Well, it is interesting. I was just had a kind of end of summer vacation with my kids, and we were going through grocery stores together and picking out foods, and we started looking. I've got them to now look at the label, and they were noting how there were 3 to 4 times as many just grams of sugar in concentrated orange juice or apple juice than you have in a few cans of Coca-Cola or whatever. And
wow.
The challenge is, most whole foods, vegetables in particular, even green ones are always the best and stuff. But when you get into fruits, if you eat a whole apple, that's not that bad for you at all in terms of the sugar in it, because you're eating the outside of the apple. The skin has some nutrients, and you're getting the fiber, and your body's digesting it slowly. But when you drink a cup of apple juice, you're essentially just having all the sugar distilled from 10 apples that you wouldn't eat in one sitting. And I don't think people have taken time to consider that. If I had a menu of bad drinks in front of me, including sugary soda, energy drinks, diet sodas, whatever, and then you had an apple juice and an orange juice, the last thing I would drink is apple juice or the orange juice. Same thing applies to dried fruits, by the way, where you look at like dried mangoes or dried peaches. That's essentially just stripping out all the nutrients and leaving the wilted sugar behind. So we miss out on some of those things kind of in the daily habits. Then, of course, we've got to watch out for the most carbohydrates that are processed, refined carbohydrates, I should say. They essentially convert to sugars when they hit the bloodstream. So to watch for, and natural carbohydrates like you get in vegetables are nowhere near as bad as what you have in a lot of packaged foods. But I think we've got to be more aware of the amount of sugar we're taking in, and especially relative to things that are just all carbs and sugar without much protein or nutritional value. That can be a real challenge. So one of the things I wrote about in Eat, Move, Sleep is, I'm always looking at the labels on foods, and instead of looking at calories, which is just kind of an arbitrary measure of quantity, in my opinion, I always try and look for how can I get a good ratio of protein to carbohydrates, where closer to 1 to 1 is good, where if it's about even on protein and carbs, that's usually a better food than something that has 10 or 20 carbs for every 1 gram of protein. And I've found that to be a better general quick benchmark when I'm looking through labels than something is. I think calories are just too abstract and don't tell me enough about quality.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right when you say calories are more quantity and not identifying the quality of the food. Another thing that I grew up, I guess my parents were always like, "Oh, eat the wheat bread, the wheat's good for you." And then in your book, you say you need to cut down on bread in general. What are some things that we can do if we're at our desk or we're going out and grabbing a quick sandwich that we can do to kind of cut down on some of that bread?
Yeah, I love bread as much as anyone else, and the hardest thing in the world for me to do from a willpower standpoint is when I'm at a restaurant, and if I ask them not to bring the bread basket, because I know if they bring it, the game's over. I eat at least half of it, if not the whole basket.
Me too.
So I like trying to get ahead of that and just saying, you know what, can you not bring that because we're not going to eat it? And so that gets some of it out of the way. When I am stuck and need to get a sandwich or something that has 2 buns, I often have a breakfast sandwich with English muffin. I just throw out one of the 2 buns and only eat one of the 2. Or better yet, what I've learned to do, even though it's not the easiest thing at lunch, is always try and make something into a salad and then get the salad without the pita bread or without the slice of bread that comes along with it many times, because those are just unnecessary carbohydrates that do convert to sugar when they hit the bloodstream. And, one of the things I've done continuously over the last year or so is I've been tracking my continuous glucose levels. At first, I was doing it with a little glucometer you get for $10 at a drugstore. And more recently, they've come out with a little sticker you put on your arm that gives you continuous glucose measurements. And boy, is it a fascinating way to look at how your body reacts to every single meal and food that you ingest. So I know right away that if I splurge and have a piece of pizza, that's going to send my baseline glucose from a normal 90 to 100 level all the way up to 180. And I've learned that the most disturbing learning has been that French fries are probably the worst thing for me. And they take me up by about 100 points. Just a single pack of McDonald's French fries will knock my blood glucose up by 100 points. Whereas there are other foods that I might have thought would disrupt my glucose and routine that don't anywhere near as much. So it's been a really good way. And I mean, even if you just go spend $15 on a glucometer at the drugstore and take your 5 or 10 most frequently consumed meals and watch how your body responds about an hour or two after you've eaten it, it's a pretty good tell. Because from what I've read, a lot of people will probably go have a burger or sandwich and French fries and don't realize that that's spiking their blood sugar well above 150, in some cases above 200, which is, I don't think you want your post-meal glucose there anytime, but yet that happens. I read a piece of research the other day showing that 80% of people in the United States, when they're fed typical cereal with milk in the morning, 80% of people have a spike to a glucose level that would be considered diabetic or pre-diabetic. And they just don't realize it because we're not watching it moment by tick like that. I think as more sensors are built into devices and watches like you're talking about, especially when we can get to continuous glucose, I think that'll change people's diets pretty profoundly.
Yeah, I think that's a huge thing. I know for me, it's pretty. Diabetes is a pretty big deal. My dad, he had diabetes, and my uncle as well. And I ended up giving my uncle my kidney because he lost that through diabetes. And so yeah, but monitoring that stuff and understanding it is extremely important. And I know I tried the keto diet for a while. I've kind of just gotten out of that completely and try to stick more with just lower carbs. But I could tell whenever I would cheat and eat something, like I could feel it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I could feel that rush of glucose in my veins.
Yeah, I think I've looked across all those diets and tried different things from the timing and intermittent to the keto, and I've studied all those diets really closely over the years. And I think you're right that what it comes down to is minimizing carbs generally, minimizing sugar. I personally minimize kind of high processed meats and saturated fats and the like, just because for my own health, I have a real high risk of various cancers, and I realize that those are related with higher risk rates for about every major type of cancer. So I've minimized some of those things. And I think if you can figure out how to do that, where you're eating more whole foods, you're eating more nuts and legumes, and you're eating more green leafy vegetables, you can find a diet that's more sustainable over time, whereas a lot of the trendy diets aren't sustainable for 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I think being sustainable is very important, because, like I said, I did the keto for a while, but it wasn't sustainable for me. And I think having something that you can stick to and you're comfortable with, but is also healthy, is the good balance that you need to have.
Yeah, a lot of it gets back to kind of Michael Pollan's one of my favorites, is his early work where it's, I think he said something along the lines of eat less, mostly plants, mostly leafy green vegetables. And most of us are consuming just far too much stuff overall. And then if you can minimize the refined carbs and the sugars and the high fat, and there's no reason for people to be eating the quantities of fried foods in particular. I'd just throw those out too while we're at it.
Yeah, I agree. I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about, you have a documentary out, Fully Charged. Can you talk a little bit about what that's about and kind of why you went into the path of a documentary versus, I guess it kind of follows your book. Are You Fully Charged? Some, but why you decided a documentary would reach different people or more people?
Yeah, I was impressed by the reach of a lot of documentaries on the topic of diet and health, from Forks Over Knives to some of the other documentaries I've seen recently that get more into how we eat and why we eat. And so we tried to pull together a group of the top experts that we've admired, from the Army Surgeon General, who's done a lot of good work on sleep, to Brian Wansink, who wrote the book Mindless Eating. And he's done some of the most influential work on food in terms of how you structure your cabinets and refrigerator at home and setting healthy defaults. So he's in there talking. We interviewed him where he's actually in his home showing you his cupboards and how he hides the tortilla chips in the laundry room on a different floor of his house so he doesn't eat them. And then we've also got some really good stuff in there on movement and how kind of building those breaks into the day makes such a difference. And we put that together in a documentary form for the sole reason that I think there are a lot of people who will only learn in a visual way like that nowadays and won't sit down and read a narrative nonfiction book. And so we're experimenting with things to try to adapt to people's changing learning styles and see what resonates. So that was a really fun experiment in that regard for me, because we got to sit down and talk with some of the leading experts I've admired. And I think it's helped a very different group of people to learn about some of the basic concepts in both Eat, Move, Sleep and Are You Fully Charged?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of psychology behind there too. Just, the color of your plates and just some very fascinating things that I think people will find interesting in there. Well, I've really appreciated having you on, and I want to say your books have made a big impact in my life, just when it comes to walking meetings, the 10,000 steps, cutting out some sugar, and understanding health in general. And I really appreciate all that you've put out there, and I can't wait to read more of your stuff when it comes out there. If you could just tell people how they can find out more about you and your work and learn more about these topics we talked about.
Yeah, and thank you so much for your time and for your listeners' time and attention as they've been following along with this. They can find out more about the documentary or books or any of the things that we've been working on. See some of the best clips from that documentary are also on tomrath.org is the best place to start, and that has links to all those different things that people can check out.
All right. Thanks so much. And we'll link that up in the show notes as well.
Perfect. Thanks again for your time. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you.